My friend Hypnosis Fantastica is interested in the intersection of archetypes and psychedelics, which is indeed a fascinating topic that I would love to talk about. The caveat is that I don't know the specific reference to Terence McKenna and archetypes. I appreciate Terence. He was a brave psychonaut and a captivating speaker and also very funny, but I don't know his specific takes on archetypes in regards to psychedelics. I want to wade into the subject using another psychedelic heavyweight and pioneer called Stan Grof. Stanislav Grof was born in Czechoslovakia, where he studied Freudian psychoanalysis, which is known as the first wave of psychology. This is important because Stan would go on to help develop the third wave, which is humanistic psychology, and the fourth wave, which is transpersonal psychology, which is essentially the subject of this video. Soon after receiving his certification, Stan Grof began delving into psychedelic therapy, using specifically LSD with his patients. He was invited to Johns Hopkins University in 1967 to continue this work. He stayed there for 5 or 6 years and then was invited to the Esalen Institute in California. As many people will know, Esalen is famous in its own right for being a huge New Age hotspot, specifically the epicenter of the human potential movement. This psychological movement was founded more or less by Abraham Maslow and Anthony Sutic. Maslow is the one who's famous for developing the so-called hierarchy of needs, apparently potentially appropriated from another culture, but at any rate, it figures in heavily into New Age thought. As sort of an aside, Esalen is an absolutely gorgeous place. It is situated just off of Highway 1 in California. It has these gorgeous, beautiful hot springs, as well as a river that flows down to the ocean. So it's this confluence of waters that was very sacred, by the way, to the Esalen people who were unfortunately colonized out of existence almost entirely. At any rate, Stan Grof arrived at Esalen in 1973 and ended up staying for about 15 years as a scholar in residence. During that time, he worked with a former professor of mine named Richard Tarnas, who I talked about in a previous video as being the founder of archetypal astrology. Now, at that time, he was not an astrologist. He came there to study psychedelics and psychedelic therapy. He came from Harvard, graduated summa cum laude, so he was very skeptical of these kind of things. However, when he started working with Stan Grof, they were both interested in this vexing question: why were people who took psychedelics at the same time, they're in the same dosage, in the same setting, were having wildly different experiences? What could be the explanation behind that? After delving into this question for years, Grof and Tarnas found to their mutual surprise that one of the most reliable indicators of the quality of somebody's trip had to do with their astrological transits, specifically the transits of their outer planets, the so-called transpersonal planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. This discovery led Richard Tarnas to dive more deeply into astrology. He eventually wrote a book called Cosmos in Psyche that explores the history of the last 500 years or so through the lens of archetypal astrology. For his part, Stan Grof went on to develop something called holotropic breathwork, which is a way to enter an altered state of consciousness using deep, sustained breathing. He developed this, of course, because by the late 60s and certainly by the 70s, psychedelics had become criminalized. Much of this I actually learned firsthand through a class that I took with Stan Grof and Richard Tarnas called Cosmos in Psyche. In fact, I took several iterations of this class. I had been already sympathetic to psychedelic use because it has been part of my spiritual journey, but it was through this class that I became much more sympathetic to astrology. That said, my interest in astrology is primarily psychological. I'm fascinated by the 10 planetary archetypes and interested in how they might be working in my life. I'm definitely not here to convince anyone that astrology is real, the so-called gold standard of woo, but I'm very sympathetic to the practice, to the art, to the language of astrology, partly because some of my best friends are astrologers. I'm also very sympathetic to transpersonal psychology, which, as its name implies, goes beyond the personal and recognizes that spiritual experiences, spiritual beliefs, epiphanies, peak experiences, as Maslow called them, these are all very important in our psychological well-being and, frankly, in our happiness.